Well, Larry Fink is someone who's obviously a member of the elite, and he's also a person who throughout his entire career has been pretty obsessed with risk management. So I think, whatever this new financial system is, it's that he is, part of this group that's proposing this, ultimately is about trying to enable BlackRock to continue its massive expansion to own, essentially everything. I wasn't really surprised because it's a position that Elon Musk has had for some time. That particular tweet you're referring to that was relatively recent is not the first time that he's sort of openly or publicly endorsed the idea of either a carbon tax or carbon markets. And I think that's no mistake, because ultimately both parties agree that the solution is the smart wall. That doesn't work. Are pretty cutthroat and criminal, because that's how you rise to the top of that particular sphere. So the first time I really wrote meaningfully about Larry Fink was probably a few years ago. In relations to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where Larry Fink is a principal. It's like a UN sponsored organization that was co-founded by Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England and later Bank of Canada, former Goldman Sachs. And also Mike Bloomberg is a big figure there, the former mayor of New York and a well-known billionaire who, started off at Salomon Brothers. So these are essentially bankers developing what amounts to a major component of UN-sponsored policy directly related to their climate change policies. And basically what GFANZ proposes is creating a new financial governance system, seizing what they call the new Bretton Woods moment. Basically, recreating the global financial system and also reimagining the multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera, which came out of actual Bretton Woods, right? So they want to move all of that into a new paradigm. Larry Fink's been particularly vocal about that. And what GFANZ proposes specifically is merging the members of GFANZ with the multilateral development banks as a way to basically use the same debt slavery model that the MDBs have been criticized for using, but instead of using it to further U.S. empire or the dollar and things of that nature, it's instead the proposal is to use it to create better enabling environments in countries for the green investments of these large financial institutions and asset managers. So it's basically like perpetuating the same model of the MDBs, but having basically Wall Street run it under the guise that it's a planetary necessity. And that we can't get to net zero without this, which frankly, if you look into the explanations for that, there's no way that's the case. But that's, how I first started writing about Larry Fink was because of his involvement in this relatively open plan to create a new financial system, which among other things, doesn't just rest on the MDBs, but also on the development of global carbon markets, which comes up in this particular piece in a pretty meaningful way. Well, Larry Fink is someone who's obviously a member of the elite, and he's also a person who throughout his entire career has been pretty obsessed with risk management. So I think, whatever this new financial system is, it's that he is, part of this group that's proposing this, ultimately is about trying to enable BlackRock to continue its massive expansion to own, essentially everything with, as little risk to them as possible, which obviously a lot of the stuff that Fink is pushing for is part of this broader system that the world's being pushed into under the guise of sustainable development that includes things like digital IDs and carbon markets and all of that, setting something up where it's will be very difficult to challenge BlackRock's financial prominence and dominance, really, and anything that Fink and others would view as a risk to, their current trajectory, I guess. They don't really have to worry about people or movements like that as they enter into and sort of impose upon us these new systems, which includes, some of these forms of digital control, like the CBDC and their private sector equivalents, for example, programmable surveillable money, and, tied into the digital ID thing. All of this, as is noted in the article, is meant to interface with global carbon markets and the multilateral development banks that Fink has been targeting in particular through GFANZ and also, BlackRock itself has been pretty focused on them. They're seeking to, the World Bank is developing climate wallet functionality and a lot of this other infrastructure on which global carbon markets would rely, and are also attempting to become the main data storage for the digital ID system as well. So a lot of big moves are being made through these institutions for part of this new global financial governance system, as GFANZ calls it. Yeah, I wasn't really surprised because it's a position that Elon Musk has had for some time. That particular tweet you're referring to that was relatively recent is not the first time that he's sort of openly or publicly endorsed the idea of either a carbon tax or carbon markets. He's also endorsed a lot of other things that are supported more broadly by groups like the World Economic Forum, like UBI, for example, and some other policies as well. And, a lot of the success of Tesla, for example, has been related to sort of this ESG push in some ways, and in terms of the idea that we need to replace all fossil fuel consuming vehicles with electric vehicles. And Tesla is obviously the market leader in that, at least in the United States. So he definitely seems to be aligned in significant ways with some of these policies. So I'm not particularly surprised. I mean, in terms of his what he says, his rhetoric, he's a lot more. He's very openly anti-woke, quote unquote. But a lot of his policies that he's promoted are a lot more in line with the woke crowd, the globalist people, and all of that. Even if I think it's more of his opposition is found in sort of the culture war space, not so much on actual policy or economic policy in particular. Just look at how Larry Fink has been behaving over the past 2-ish years. He was known as a big ESG guy, right? And then he openly abandoned the ESG terminology and straight up said that climate finance, green finance, all of that stuff he's involved in is about profits, not about wokeness or saving the planet or whatever. And since then has also 180'd his stance on Bitcoin and has essentially changed a lot of his talking points, which I think is very notable because, Larry Fink, among other things, is on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. And I think the World Economic Forum is misunderstood by a lot of people, and people use certain terms to refer to what they are and what they do. But ultimately what that group is about advancing the public-private partnership model. And of course, there's two sides to that, much like there is in the prevailing left-right paradigm of most countries' politics. And for a long time, they've leaned sort of on the public side and used talking points that are meant to appeal to the political left, and have gotten a lot of pushback as a result. And so, if you notice, people like Fink, but other people as well, have moved their rhetoric away from those seeking to appeal to the political left in the public side of the public-private partnership, leaning into the private aspect of the public-private partnership and having more right-leaning talking points. But ultimately, all are trying to lead you to the same exact system of digital ID, programmable, surveillable money, and global carbon markets. And I think, the carbon market in particular, it's sort of hard to extricate that from the climate change, situation. But I think it looks like, people like Fink and some of the people in that particular space are going to attempt to market it as something that can make people very wealthy or allow them to get quick access to capital by tokenizing their land holdings and fractionalizing their private property, using different things that haven't been able to be financialized before, and then bringing that on chain and using that as collateral, receiving loans that way and all of that. There's a lot of ambitious plans in that particular space. And aside from that, there's been this push led by the Rockefeller Foundation and some other groups through this whole push for natural asset corporations, where they basically openly talk about the idea to expand the amount of assets in the existing financial system by 5 or 6 fold by incorporating what they refer to as natural assets. So this is sort of like the financializing of the natural world and turning, allowing people to sell ecosystem services and all of that. And, this is part of the broader effort to usher in a global carbon market. So anyway, I think it's interesting that there's a lot of this shift going on. I think it's a big part of why someone like Javier Milei was given the main stage at WEF and then openly praised by the WEF that he was the WEF elites that he was supposedly scolding in that speech. They very much embraced Milei's vision, and we're like, yeah, we should have the private sector lead the public-private partnerships and all of that. But ultimately, the public and the private, as represented within the WEF, agree about the plan. Maybe there's, how it's implemented or how it's sold to people. There's differences there, but ultimately they agree about where we're going in terms of like digital ID. A global ledger and all of this stuff, programmable, surveillable money, whether it's private sector issued or central bank issued, ultimately the end results are somewhat the same, but there's an effort to sort of change the sales pitch for all of that. And you can see it in Fink and you can see it in other people. Well, I think there's always certain ways people go about trying to justify why these leaders that have this particular mismatch we're pointing to here, why they do those things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it does an extreme disservice to their campaign promises, which they end up not fulfilling in a meaningful way. So, if you take one of, for example, Trump's main campaign promises to drain the swamp, and he has like multiple swamp creatures running key aspects of his government. Sure, he maybe had to make deals, art of the deal guy, right? He had to make deals for particular things to get through. But, if you do too much of that, you don't end up delivering on anything. So I'm sure people can justify that. But in this particular case, I think outcomes matter a lot more than rhetoric, just because of where things are. And I think ultimately about why this is happening has to do with them trying to get people to voluntarily sign on or onboard themselves to these systems they're developing. And so if that's not going to happen successfully with like left-leaning talking points, and they're going to try talking points of the other variety to herd people into the same system, I don't think there's disagreement about the system. From people on the left or people on the right. There's a lot of things that have an extreme bipartisan consensus that are very bad for individual freedom and individual liberty in the U.S. in particular and elsewhere as well. And, these guys ultimately agree over it. It's about the rhetoric that's being used to sell it. And it's important to keep in mind, too, that like the World Economic Forum this year and for the past several years post-COVID, the themes of their annual meetings have been framed around rebuilding trust. And so they know which group does not trust them, the group that's pushing back against ESG and these other talking points and initiatives that have been coming out of the WEF for several years. And now in order to rebuild trust, they're putting different figures, different people, and different talking points, in front of people and seeing if they'll be more accepting of the ultimate game plan if it's framed in different terms that appeal more to their values and their sensibilities, and also framed as opposing, particular figures that they don't like or they don't trust, Yeah, I think part of it too is just like a failure for people to really understand the left-right paradigm and how it works. One of the hands creates the problem and the other hand comes in, the opposing side, then comes to power and is, on offering the solution to the problem the other hand created, but it's the same solution both sides agreed on the whole time, more often than not. I'll give you an example with Trump, the border wall. So that was like his big thing. I'm going to build a physical barrier. I'm going to build a physical wall. And then Democrats at that time said, no, our approach to border security is to build a smart wall. Yeah, built on sensors and autonomous drones and towers, surveillance towers and all this stuff. And then by the time Trump leaves his first term, that's his position too. The wall we're going to build is a smart wall. We're not doing the physical barrier anymore. That was essentially his position in January 2019. And he and the Democrats are, in the same spot on border security. But somehow he's still seen as like the president that like plans to do the wall, even though in terms of rhetoric, he abandoned that and was going with the Silicon Valley approach of this company. The company that's building that smart wall has a bipartisan consensus. It's deeply tied to the CIA and has a lot of very troubling affiliations. and is developing like drones. You know, there's the drones on the border, and then there's the drones made by the same company that are being used in Ukraine right now to kill people without human oversight and stuff. You know, it's not really a great solution, I think. You know, but it's not what Trump's base necessarily wants either, because all this infrastructure is set up on the border now. This smart wall is there, but is it really working? I mean, obviously not, because of the extreme situation on the border currently. And the solution being proposed by the Senate is to fund even more of these smart wall towers. And, you know, this ultimately ties into the same goals of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development agenda of having freedom of movement restricted and controlled through biometric means, all tied up with the whole digital ID thing and live facial recognition and all of this. You know, that's what the smart wall implementation is really about, is having all ports of entry into the US being managed that way. And it's being rolled out simultaneously in places like the EU and Britain as well, and really throughout the world. And this is the particular way of selling it in the US. You know, but both parties agree with it. And now, because of the frenzy over the border situation that's being fed, you know, in a significant way by mainstream media, it's been bad for a long time, but the attention given to it has risen precipitously. And I think that's no mistake, because ultimately both parties agree that the solution is the smart wall. That doesn't work.
Thank you for joining us today on this insightful journey into the world of crypto and investing. If you found value in today's discussion and want to stay updated on future crypto news and market insights, don't forget to hit subscribe button below and click the notification bell. By subscribing, you'll be part of our growing community, gaining exclusive access to timely analyses and strategies. I look forward to having you with us in the next video.